During World War II, every backyard garden had a purpose. People grew food not just to feed their families, but to help keep the country going. Yet, hidden among those rows of beans and carrots were crops that quietly disappeared. Some were banned for spreading pests and disease. Others were for being too invasive or too risky to grow when food supplies were scarce. Below are 20 garden crops that were banned, and some of them you know. Elderberries. During World War II, elderberries were both a blessing and a problem. Their deep purple clusters lined country roads and backyard fences, prized for jams, wines, and tonics, said to fight colds. Families picked them by the bucket, and their rich flavor made them a favorite when sugar and imported fruits were scarce. But as demand rose, so did trouble. Scientists discovered that parts of the plant, especially the unripe berries and stems, contained cyanogenic compounds that could release small amounts of poison if handled or cooked improperly. A few cases of illness were enough to draw attention. At the same time, elderberry wine became associated with illegal homebrewing, something wartime authorities were eager to control. So, by the mid-1940s, restrictions appeared across several states, and nurseries stopped stocking them. What had once been a dependable homestead fruit quietly disappeared from many wartime gardens. Mulberries. Mulberries once shaded many wartime backyards, their long, sweeping branches heavy with dark, sweet fruit that stained children's hands and laundry alike. They were a familiar sight near chicken coops and barns where their fallen berries kept livestock fed and happy. But during World War II, the government began discouraging their growth. The problem wasn't the fruit, it was the trees. Their heavy pollen caused widespread allergies and respiratory irritation at a time when medical care was focused on soldiers and civilians injured in war industries. Cities started cutting them down to reduce health complaints, and new plantings were quietly banned in several areas. Even though the berries remained useful for jams and pies, mulberry trees were labeled as more trouble than they were worth. By the end of the decade, the once beloved trees that marked summer's arrival had nearly vanished from neighborhood streets and family gardens. Gooseberries. Still on berries, gooseberries were once a common wartime fruit, tucked along fences and garden edges where their sharp thorns kept pests away. Their tart green berries made perfect pies, jams, and preserves when sugar was scarce, and families prized them for their reliability. But in the early 1940s, a hidden danger brought an abrupt end to their popularity. Gooseberries acted as carriers for white pine blister rust, a devastating fungus that threatened the nation's timber supply, a vital wartime resource for ships, planes, and housing. Federal agencies moved fast, banning gooseberries and currants across much of the country. Crews went door to door, uprooting bushes that had stood for generations. For gardeners, it was a strange sight seeing a fruit banned not for human harm, but to protect the forest itself. By war's end, the gooseberry had gone from pantry staple to forbidden crop, erased in the name of national defense. Black currants. During the war years, black currants were both a blessing and a curse. The blessing was that their deep purple berries were packed with vitamin C at a time when citrus imports were nearly impossible to find. Families used them to make syrup, jam, and juice for soldiers overseas. The curse. Behind that wartime usefulness was a secret threat. Like gooseberries, black currants carried the same white pine blister rust that endangered America's timber, a resource the military couldn't afford to lose. While the fruit was rich in nutrients, the government declared it an agricultural enemy. Fields were cleared, bushes burned, and growers forced to abandon generations of cultivation. The irony was painful. A fruit that once helped keep families healthy during shortages became outlawed in the name of protecting forests. Only decades later did people begin to realize how much flavor and history had been lost in that wartime ban. Persimmons. American persimmons faced a quiet downfall during World War II. The confusion around their ripeness became their undoing. Many people, impatient for sweetness, bit into unripe fruits and were met with an unbearable astringent taste that puckered the mouth and made the fruit seem inedible. Word spread fast that persimmons were bitter and useless, and home gardeners began cutting down their trees without realizing the truth. When left to ripen fully, especially after the first frost, the fruits turned soft, sweet, and rich, with a flavor compared to honey and apricots. Native tribes and early settlers understood this perfectly and relied on the fruit through harsh winters. But wartime urgency for reliable, easy-to-grow crops left little room for misunderstood plants. The slow-ripening persimmon fell out of favor, its sweetness forgotten by a generation that had no time to wait for nature's patience to pay off. Serviceberries, Juneberries. Before the war, nearly every backyard had a serviceberry bush. Their white spring blossoms gave way to deep purple berries that looked like small blueberries and tasted just as sweet. Families baked them into pies and dried them for winter snacks. But when World War II began, these shrubs quietly vanished from many neighborhoods. They weren't banned because they were harmful, but because they competed for space with crops considered more useful. The government pushed citizens to grow vegetables and calorie-dense foods, not fruit bushes that attracted birds. Serviceberries were also blamed for spreading diseases to commercial apple orchards, which sealed their fate. By the late 1940s, they were almost forgotten outside the wild. The same plant that once fed children's hands straight from the bush was written off as impractical, its beauty and sweetness sacrificed for wartime efficiency. Pawpaws. Long before bananas filled grocery stores, pawpaws were America's own tropical fruit. Their creamy yellow flesh tasted like a mix of mango and custard, and their trees dotted riverbanks and backyards across the eastern states. Families would gather them in baskets during late summer, and children often followed the scent to where the fruit had dropped and ripened in the grass. But during World War II, pawpaws were largely forgotten. They bruised easily, spoiled fast, and couldn't be shipped like apples or canned like peaches, making them useless for rations or long-term storage. Victory gardens focused on produce that could be stored through winter, not fruit that vanished in days. By the war's end, pawpaws had nearly disappeared from the national diet. What was once a wild treat of the Midwest faded into memory, waiting decades to be rediscovered by backyard growers. Beach plums. Along the Atlantic coast, beach plums once grew wild in the sandy dunes, their glossy purple fruit thriving where little else could. Families living near the shore knew precisely when to harvest them right before the fruit softened and burst in the sun. The tart plums made some of the best jams and jellies anyone could spread on a biscuit, their flavor sharp and rich enough to rival any store-bought preserve. But during World War II, these coastal fruits lost their place in American gardens. They weren't easily cultivated inland, and their low yields couldn't compete with commercial crops needed for the war effort. Many wild groves were cleared for coastal defenses and military bases, wiping out generations of naturally growing fruit. By the time the war ended, beach plums had nearly vanished, remembered mostly by families who once gathered them along the dunes on late summer mornings. Wild grapes. Back in the 1940s, wild grapes still wound their way through fences, old orchards, and woodland edges, feeding both people and wildlife alike. But by the wartime years, these vines had fallen out of favor. They grew fast, spread far, and refused to stay neat, which didn't fit the new image of tidy, controlled gardens that spread during the war effort. To keep things uniform, many landowners pulled the vines out entirely, calling them weeds. Wartime chemical herbicides made it easy to erase them from fence rows and pastures. Yet the fruit itself was far from useless. Their deep flavor made some of the richest homemade jellies, wines, and juices of the time. But in an age that prized order and mass production, wild grapes didn't stand a chance against modern ideas of what a garden should look like. Crab apples. During World War II, crab apples were quietly pushed aside as farmers and gardeners focused on larger, sweeter fruit for wartime food supplies. These small, tart apples were once a staple in jellies, ciders, and preserves, valued for their bright flavor and reliable harvests. But by the 1940s, nurseries began breeding them mainly for looks, selecting trees that flowered beautifully but bore no usable fruit. Practical varieties were replaced with ornamentals, and the line between food and decoration slowly faded. Many people forgot that crab apples were even edible. Still, the old-timers knew their worth. These hardy trees could survive frost, poor soil, and neglect, producing fruit when regular apple trees failed. Yet in a time when convenience and uniformity ruled, the humble crab apple was dismissed as outdated, left behind in the rush toward a modern food system. Chokecherries. These dark, glossy berries once lined rural roads and windbreaks across the countryside, ripening just as summer began to fade. During the war years, though, chokecherries gained an unwanted reputation. The seeds and leaves contained cyanogenic compounds that could release poison if eaten in large amounts, and with rationing already causing food anxiety, the government didn't want any confusion about what was safe. In many regions, people were warned not to eat them at all, and entire thickets were cut down near pastures where livestock grazed. Yet before that, they were prized for jellies, syrups, and homemade wines that carried a sharp, wild flavor you couldn't find in store-bought fruit. Families who knew how to prepare them safely kept the tradition alive, even as others turned away. By the end of the war, chokecherries had nearly vanished from everyday kitchens. Huckleberries. In the early 1940s, huckleberries were still gathered by hand from wooded hillsides and mountain slopes, a quiet, late summer ritual for rural families. But wartime restrictions and forest management efforts changed that. With so many areas turned into protected timber zones or military land, huckleberry picking was banned in several regions to prevent wildfires and overharvesting. The government considered the activity a distraction from farm production, something people couldn't afford to waste time on. Yet for generations, these small purple berries had been treasured for their rich, wine-like taste in pies and preserves. Children carried tin pails through the brush, while grandparents turned the harvest into thick jams for winter. When access was cut off, the loss felt deeper than just food. It was the end of a yearly rhythm that tied people to the land in ways modern agriculture never could. Mayhaw trees once dotted the edges of southern swamps and creeks, where families collected the small red fruits that fell after spring floods. The berries made one of the most prized jellies in the South, bright and tart, often saved for Sunday breakfasts or given as gifts. But during the war, wild harvesting became restricted as wetland areas were drained or fenced off for agricultural production. Officials encouraged people to focus on high-yield crops that supported the war effort, not regional delicacies that required foraging. In some places, gathering mayhaw fruit was even discouraged to keep people away from mosquito-heavy swamp areas, thought to spread disease. Slowly, those trees went untended, and the annual harvests faded. What was once a proud local staple nearly disappeared until small communities brought it back, decades later, as a taste of the past that wartime rules had nearly erased. Sand cherries. Sand cherries thrived in the dry plains and windy hills of the Midwest. Tough little shrubs that produced dark fruit, loved for pies and preserves. Before the war, they were a dependable source of food where few other fruits would grow. But by the 1940s, agricultural programs labeled them unproductive and replaced them with uniform crop fields and erosion control plantings. Their wild growth habits didn't align with the push for efficient, controlled farming driven by wartime needs. Many windbreaks filled with sand cherries were cut down to make way for crops considered more valuable. Yet older farmers remembered how the fruit had once sustained families during the Dust Bowl and Depression. Its disappearance wasn't due to taste or usefulness. It was simply caught in the shift toward industrial farming, when even the hardiest native crops lost their place in the nation's food plan. Autumn olives. Autumn olives were once praised as miracle plants. Their silvery leaves shimmered in the sun, and their red, speckled berries were packed with vitamins and antioxidants. In the early 1940s, they were promoted as soil protectors and wildlife feed, ideal for erosion control on farms affected by overuse. The government even handed out seedlings to plant along fence rows and open fields. But it didn't take long for the enthusiasm to fade. Autumn olives spread aggressively, sprouting anywhere birds dropped their seeds, and quickly began overrunning native vegetation. What had started as a patriotic conservation effort turned into an ecological problem no one had predicted. By the time the war ended, fields once planted with autumn olive were nearly impossible to reclaim. It became one of many well-meant wartime introductions that showed how quickly good intentions could go wrong when nature had other plans. Cornelian cherries. Cornelian cherry trees stood out in early spring gardens with their yellow blossoms that bloomed long before other fruit trees woke. The small red fruits were tart but valuable. They were used in preserves, syrups, and old-fashioned wines. They were once popular in home orchards because of their beauty and reliability. During World War II, however, they fell out of favor as orchard space was redirected to crops that promised higher calorie content and faster yields. The Cornelian cherry's slow growth and limited fruiting made it seem impractical when every acre was expected to serve the war effort. Many trees were cut down or simply abandoned. Only a few old yards and rural homesteads kept them alive, their fruit ripening quietly each summer. After the war, they became a reminder of how quickly even the most cherished plants could vanish when efficiency replaced tradition. Medlars. Medlars looked like something between an apple and a rosehip, but they were unlike any fruit most Americans had seen. They had to be picked late and left to soften until the pulp turned brown and sweet, a process called bletting. During the war, they were still found in a few heirloom orchards, especially in the Northeast, where old gardeners remembered them from English tradition. But as food standards changed, medlars became misunderstood. Their strange, overripe texture made inspectors wary, and many markets stopped accepting them altogether. By the 1940s, they were pushed out by more uniform, easily stored fruits. The last trees vanished quietly as growers replaced them with apples and pears that looked cleaner and sold faster. What was once a prized winter fruit of the old world became one of the first casualties of modern food laws. Quinces. Quinces once filled the autumn air with their sharp, floral scent. They looked like golden apples, but were far too hard and tart to eat raw. Housewives simmered them with sugar, turning them into jellies and preserves that kept through the winter. During the war, when sugar was rationed and every bit of fruit had to count, quinces became a problem crop. They needed more sugar than almost anything else to be edible, and that made them impractical when sweetness was scarce. Some orchards tore them out for apples and pears that could be eaten fresh or canned with less effort. By the late 1940s, federal buyers had dropped quinces from their approved produce lists altogether. The trees lingered only in old farmyards, their fruit falling to the ground untouched, reminders of a time when patience and preservation defined home cooking. American chestnuts. Before blight wiped them out, American chestnut trees were the pride of eastern forests. Their tall trunks provided timber, and every fall Their spiny shells scattered the ground with sweet nuts that fed both families and livestock. During the war, chestnuts were still gathered by the basket, roasted or ground into flour when wheat was scarce. But the disease changed everything. The chestnut blight swept through the country like wildfire, killing billions of trees. Quarantine laws tried to slow its spread, but by the mid-1940s, growing them was nearly impossible. Even healthy trees were often cut down to stop infection from reaching nearby farms. By the time the war ended, chestnuts had vanished from American markets and memory, surviving only in stories from grandparents who once filled sacks with the fallen nuts. Barberries. Barberry shrubs once lined old gardens and fence rows, admired for their red berries and thorny branches that kept animals out. The berries made tart jams and vinegars, and during the Depression and wartime rationing, every bit of fruit was valued. But barberries had a hidden cost. They carried wheat rust, a fungus that destroyed entire fields of grain, a direct threat when bread was a rationed necessity. By the early 1940s, government programs ordered the destruction of barberry bushes across farms before they could totally wipe out several grain farms and send the country years back. Which of these 20 crops and plants do you remember? Did you know they were banned before now? Let us know in the comments below, and if you found this interesting, leave a hype and subscribe for more.